Recently, Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson took a quick trip to space. Could their short jaunt to low Earth orbit be an early indicator of what's to come and how an entirely new space tourism industry will develop and evolve? While it may seem like the stuff of sci-fi movies, the billionaire rocket ship space race actually has serious implications for the future of space tourism, almost analogous to the ways in which Bill Boeing and Donald Douglas were determined to use the airplane to move humans and cargo around the globe. Could it be the case that as time goes on, the cost and complexity of space travel will be reduced enough such that a moon vacation is within financial reach for the masses? Welcome to the IQT podcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a 3-part series where we will explore the past, present, and future of space and how IQT's investments and insights have helped advise and shape the technology to help enhance national security. On last week's episode, we discussed the past, and today we'll focus on the present. I'm your host, Vishal Sandesara, and joining me today are 2 of my colleagues here at IQT. Kristi Bradford is a senior technology architect on IQT's Field Technologies team. She is a space technology strategist with experience working across the civil, commercial, national security, and international space communities in areas as diverse as technology development, program management, space innovation policy, and the global space investment landscape. She holds an undergraduate degree in astrophysics and earth and planetary science from Harvard University, a master's degree in exploration systems design from Arizona State University, and is wrapping up another master's degree in international science and technology policy from George Washington University. Also joining me today, Kevin Schaeffer, Vice President of Technology on IQT's Field Technologies team. Kevin has over a decade of experience in the aerospace industry. He started as a structural analyst for Earth and deep space science missions for Orbital Sciences, then transitioned to advanced telescope and sensor development as a contract worker at the NRO. Kevin has been at IQT for 5 years. Welcome, Kristi. Welcome, Kevin. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
So let's just dive right into it. We're talking about the present today. This is the second of a 3-part series. We're all going to talk about the present. Why is it that IQT, from what you've seen and what you've all spent your time doing, why is it that IQT continues to dedicate resources to space? What are some of the important circumstances or reasons that necessitate that this continues to be an important area of focus for IQT and for both of you and your colleagues to focus in?
Well, what I would say is that one of the major things that we do at IQT is we look at what's happening in the commercial sector. And space is an area that is continuing to attract record amounts of investment. And that means that there is innovation being driven in the space sector that's continuing well beyond when IQT first started investing in space. And I think right now we're at a really interesting inflection point as well, where the original drivers that brought in this initial investment are still major players in the overall ecosystem, but we're starting to get new entrants that are creating an even more robust ecosystem in space that is going to really change the entire landscape in the long run.
I think there's a couple important points there. The first thing is when you ask why do we continue to look at something, it's more of a broader question for IQT writ large. When we focus on a given technology area, we usually come up with a thesis. As Dave and Tom likely discussed in the past discussion, we had an idea that there was an opportunity in the startup ecosystem to supplement the technologies available within the space world. And what we've really seen the past 5 years is we were actually correct in that regard. We have seen a transition of these technologies on orbit, which is a huge first step for any space company. And then additionally, we're starting to see tangential industries go off of this. So why we're still monitoring this, we want to make our next prediction of where we see the industry going from here.
That's really interesting. So it sounds as though perhaps a number of years ago, IQT made a bet that, hey, there's likely going to be a large ecosystem here. We should start sort of having understanding and a thesis around how we want to get involved and where we want to focus our energy and attention. And likely that thesis has evolved a little bit, but the hypothesis largely has remained true. This is an interesting and frothy area, both in terms of capabilities development as well as money and financial returns go, as you've all touched on. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the present, the reason we're here today, the current landscape. What is it that's important about the way that the industry has shaped up in current context, and how is it different perhaps from what you all have seen, in the past? Without getting too much into the past, since clearly we have a separate podcast recording for that, what is it that's important to mention when it comes to the current context and how it may be different or perhaps evolved?
I'll go ahead and start there, and then I'll give it over to Kristi. But quickly to touch on the past, the simple question in the past was, can it be done? And we've answered that question time and time again. So now that we've gotten past, can it be done? Can one of these companies operate a satellite on more limited budgets than we're used to? The question becomes what and how. So that's what we're looking at today. What are the new sensing modalities they can offer? How are they going to do that? And what are the other industries that are going to enable that kind of technology transition?
Yeah, I would add to that there's really two things that I see coming out of it. One is that now that the basics have been proven out, we're starting to see more complex approaches. And Kevin's point about sensing modalities, we're starting to see more complex sensing modalities reach orbit from companies that are sort of following in the path of the very first companies that put the simplest sensors on there on orbit as possible to just prove out that commercial companies could do this and do it successfully. And then I think the second piece is that as more and more satellites are getting launched by these commercial firms, it's changing the space environment in such a way that there's now a whole new ecosystem that's developing around how do we make sure that space remains a sustainable environment, and how do we make sure that all of these new space actors can be working together in a cohesive environment that works for all actors.
Yeah, just real quick, Vishal, on the sensing modalities points, just to kind of hammer it home. What we're talking about there is, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the simple picture, but the types of pictures you can basically capture from space go far beyond that. We're talking about in the IR spectrum, the hyperspectral spectrum. And really what we like to see is it possible to do that in the satellite form factor? So that's really what we're focusing on today, pushing the envelope of those data products that are available.
We talked a lot about resilience. I recall both you and also the speakers that we have for the sort of the past, and I assume the future. We'll talk a lot about this concept of resilience, an important concept when considering something as mission critical as space travel. How do you both think through resilience when it comes to the present context of space? For example, in the context of investments or the way that we think through technology and the way it may evolve, how does resilience play a role in how your optic is scoped around where to check for built-in capability, where capability might be needed, or where evolution needs to take place in the industry?
Yeah, I would say that there's many, many different ways to think about resilience, and it's important to think about resilience in all of those different ways. A few of the ways that we think about it here at IQT is one way is by helping our government partners leverage commercial technologies. It makes their supply chain more resilient because their suppliers are no longer entirely reliant on the government, because there's also these commercial markets that these companies are working with and supplying to as well. So there's a resilience aspect there. There's also the idea that when we are looking at a given space, with space technology being a prime example, we aren't necessarily going to place bets in just one company and rely on just one company. We want to have a portfolio approach so that if one company were to ever go under, there's still other companies out there that can fulfill the needs of the market, whether it's the commercial market or the government market. And so making sure that there's no single point of failure, both from a technology perspective as well as from a business perspective, is really key to how we at IQT think about resilience.
Yeah, and there's a couple of reasons it's extremely important. The first is probably foremost, it's difficult to get things into space. So usually you're only getting one chance to do it. So the more you can have, the better. The second thing to point out is that a traditional satellite in a LEO, that's a low Earth orbit, is only going to hit the commonplace on Earth once every 90 minutes. And that's actually transitioning depending on the orbit. So as you get, one to many of those systems, you're not relying on that single system where if something goes poorly, you're out of operation for a while. And then the last thing in terms of supporting the ecosystem, another angle of resilience is the launch. Launch vehicles get delayed all the time. That's your ride into space. So it's great to have more and more of those as a backup or even tertiary option, such that a company who's budget constrained is not relying on a single system that will ultimately determine the fate of their business.
When it comes to national security, what are your thoughts on which of these parts of the industry that we're describing are most important or pertinent to topics or circumstances related to national security?
I mean, I guess I would say all of them are to some extent. I think it really depends on how narrow of a definition of national security you're taking. And I think you can look at it from the perspective of, space technologies are generally dual use technologies. And so there are national security applications. But I also think that it's important to think about it from the perspective of ensuring that we have a economically competitive commercial space ecosystem is also really important and part of, I think, the larger national security perspective.
And then one other point there. So there's the use of these systems, which are great supplemental tools to what the government may develop on their own. But there's a huge awareness angle that's important for national security. So if we develop a technology and another country develops the technology, you can kind of connect the dots to see what other parts of the world are going to be able to do that. And once that happens, that's a huge intelligent aspect of your national security kind of apparatus.
We talked about this a little earlier. I'll sort of foot stomp it a little further, and let's see if we can talk about it a little bit more. Space is not simply a satellite floating around taking some pictures, just as Kevin, you've mentioned. Both of you spent a lot of time looking into all the complexities of this topic, things like back-end architecture, the ways in which we access space, constellation management, for example. Can you talk to us a little bit about just how you think through the entirety of the ecosystem and where In-Q-Tel is applying a lot of its resources or is looking into the architecture to say, hey, this is an area where we should focus on when it comes to investments or improving upon commercial products, for example?
Absolutely. We use an architectural approach when we're thinking about a given technology landscape. And the current iteration of our space technology architecture is very much built around the why do you go to space in the first place? And we definitely, because of what we're seeing in the commercial market as well as what our government partners care about, we definitely think a lot about the connectivity piece of why you go to space and the Earth sensing piece. But in addition, there's so many other reasons why you might go to space. Things like position, navigation, and timing, the advantages of manufacturing things in a microgravity environment, science, human spaceflight, R&D. And so we look at this entire landscape of, why do we go to space in the first place? And in some cases, there are companies devoted to that exact why. But there's also an entire ecosystem around the why. And so we also think about what's happening in these other areas that are supporting the why we go to space. And those are things like access to space, launch being a core piece of access to space, things like constellation management, and in particular, space traffic management at a more holistic level. Things like a data backhaul, as well as data handling techniques and data processing techniques. And then, of course, you also have a set of enablers that are going to have a cross-cutting impact across all of these other areas. And so we view it as, what companies are focusing on the why versus what companies are focused on these support functions. And I would also say we do look some at the divide between the ground segment and the space segment of what aspects of these support functions are specifically on the ground or specifically in space. But what we've been observing over time is that more and more things cannot be easily placed on purely the ground segment or purely the space segment. And so more and more functions that are supporting the why you go to space are cross-cutting, and the architectures of those systems transcend the division between ground and space.
Kristi really jumped around to quite a few technology areas there, and there's an important reason for why we look at it that way, and additionally why we will deploy capital that way as well. So In-Q-Tel has a unique role as kind of being one of the stamps of approval of where things are important to the government, and we like to be a little bit prescient in that regard. So if we focus all of our investment activity in a given technology area, that might be a signal to the industry that that's the only area that should be focused on. But if we spread bets around all over the place, these key enabling technology and supporting technology areas, what that does is keeps a healthy ecosystem moving along, hopefully attracts some other investors. There's lots of knowledge networks that come along with that as well, such that 5 to 10 years from now, those areas we identified will come to full fruition.
So I like this concept of sort of the 5 to 10 year optic. At the top of our recording, I made a playful remark around billionaire space race and sort of this this hopefully what we'll find to be the reduction of complexity and costs associated with space tourism, but just access to space and then everything that comes after it. How truthful do you think that is within that time frame? In other words, in 5 to 10 years, do you sort of see the analogous thing that we always see in technology, more access, less cost, less complexity? Or do you think space is different or special in some way where perhaps there's a longer timeline, or maybe it'll just never be as ubiquitous as a lot of the other technologies as they evolve become?
Well, there's definitely longer timelines. I think people know that getting to space is hard, but I think a lot of times it's lost how difficult it actually is. The technologies used take years of development timelines. The components available aren't the same components available for terrestrial applications. That being said, there is a lot of movement, and probably more importantly, there's a lot of still investment in it. It's still kind of focused on a few large players that you alluded to. So really it's a matter of if there are businesses that are going to attract additional money, or if it's more of the kind of, I don't know the term for it, but philanthropic space expeditions that we seen to date. So I wouldn't want to say it's a guarantee. I'd be interested to see, Kristi's opinion on this, but I think it's gonna move along probably at a slower timeline that you might be seeing in the news.
Yeah, I would add to that sort of on the idea of, is space special? There's definitely things that make space unique. However, I think we need to address the fact that space isn't special. Like it still is governed by the laws of physics. It's still the economic realities of building businesses still apply to space. And so I think space is something that can generate a ton of excitement in a way that other things can't. And that's one of the unique aspects of space. But we need to not confuse excitement or hype for progress. And so I agree with Kevin that I think that oftentimes the timelines that are put out there for, when we'll have a permanent presence on the moon and when, we'll be leveraging things like space resources, oftentimes we may have a very optimistic outlook on that. And that, what you read in the news might be very, very optimistic. And when you look at the realities of just how long it takes for new markets to evolve, whether you're talking about space or whether you're talking about non-space markets, it's a slow process. The technology diffusion process is a slow process. And so I think we have to be realistic that, we're probably not going to be, mining Mars in 5 years. And so that's what I would say is that I think things like space tourism is showing that things are changing and new markets are starting to open up and to grow. But in terms of when we reach, grand visions of what the world could be, I think we still have a ways to go. And that's just simply because of the, economic, political, social realities of how the world works.
That's wise. I take that. That makes sense to me. Let me ask you both in your own experiences at IQT, what are some of the current focus areas? We talked about the architecture that you use to think through and parse the ecosystem and focus on particular areas, perhaps of where we should deploy capital. For each of you, just more so on a personal level, are there any parts of those? Is there any part of that architecture that you're most interested in, or that you're focused in right now, or placing any big bets on?
I would say that the two areas where I'm particularly focused right now is on remote sensing and advanced sensor modalities, and then on what we at IQT call space auxiliary services, which is those areas that become more important as more and more satellites get on orbit. So those are things like space traffic management, satellite servicing, in-space data handling, and eventually space resources and in-space manufacturing. And that is a topic that I think we'll discuss in a lot more detail on the next episode of this podcast.
Kristi, just for our listeners, a quick definition on remote sensing in case people are unfamiliar.
Remote sensing can be defined as being able to characterize something from a distance using the light that is either reflected or emitted from whatever it is you're looking at.
Understood. Kevin, same question to you. Areas of focus, interest, or big bets?
Well, kind of addresses all the above, but I'm probably most excited about the alternative communication techniques that are coming online. So the traditional way of doing things in the past was a large satellite in a geo orbit. That's the higher elevation orbit that remains fixed as the orbits as well. And then you have the terrestrial analog that we've had the development of the 2G to 3G to 4G to 5G networks. And really what I see happening in the next decade is there's a lot of alternatives to those types of communication techniques. So you may have heard of the Starlink constellation from SpaceX. That's a communications network in LEO that will provide constant connectivity to remote locations on Earth. There's some additional companies that are targeting more kind of small communications packet in the text message side for IoT devices. But really, as we build out the next 5-10 years, what I think is going to happen is you're going to have a menu of options depending on your application. So this is important because it's going to enable all sorts of other additional businesses, whether it's the autonomous vehicle, drone delivery worlds, where communication connection is a constant enduring need. So it's great to see there's new lower cost ways of doing things that are also additionally accessing remote parts of the Earth.
That's exciting. For the curious listener, Kristi and Kevin, open question to either of you, where would you point someone who, say, wanted to learn a little bit more about the current state of affairs, not just in space tourism, but just space in general? People are curious, are there any particular, aside from our own, blogs or resources that you'd recommend, or books?
That's a tough one because it really very much depends on the audience. I would probably say that if you just want a good primer on space and how to think about developing and operating something in space and what are some of the policy and legal challenges as well, I would actually recommend the handbook for new space actors that was put out a few years ago by the Secure World Foundation. I think that's a really good primer for folks that are new to space that potentially want to get into the industry. But I think for a more casual interest in space, I would say continue to follow what you're seeing in the news. There's also some more targeted news sources for space. So Ars Technica does really good coverage of space. There's some interesting things on TechCrunch that come up around space. Space News is a great outlet. But I would just say, as you're looking at what's being said in the news around space, always take it with a grain of salt because it's an area that can generate a lot of excitement and sometimes that excitement moves quicker than the reality of technology development.
Fair enough.
Yeah, Kristi mentioned some great online resources there. I would follow up that, interestingly enough, both the space media world, the space enthusiast world is very well connected on Twitter. So it's really as simple as when you see something in the news that's of interest, you do a quick search and pretty quickly build out the important people connected to those stories, and you'll find all sorts of additional stories that way, and you'll never be out of the loop on what's going on in space if you give those people a follow.
That's great. Thank you. One last question before we end our conversation. We spent a lot of time today talking about not only your own, but InQtel's interest in the current context in space. Are there other organizations or other countries perhaps that are worthy of mention in terms of interest, dollars, or excitement or hype? In other words, what does the landscape perhaps globally look like to sort of stretch out a pun? What is it that how is the rest of the universe thinking about space, and what is it that excites you about that?
I would actually say that the level of international engagement in space right now is one of the reasons why space is a really exciting topic area at the moment, is that because of the rise of small satellites, the rise of lower cost launch, you're starting to see a democratization of space. And so more and more countries are starting to place a strategic priority on space. And I guess to mention a few countries, although I think there's a lot of countries doing really interesting things right now, is you have countries like Japan and Luxembourg and the UK and Australia and the United Arab Emirates that are really leaning in on space and trying to sort of, find niches in the market where, players like the US aren't necessarily paying as much of attention in order to help grow their space innovation ecosystems. And I think it's a really, really exciting time for the US to be engaging with this larger ecosystem that's developing around space innovation.
That's great. Thank you. Kristi, Kevin, a pleasure talking to you both today. Thank you for your time. For our listeners, in case you want to learn more, they both have authored a blog at our blog at iqt.org/blog. You can find the link in our show notes. Again, thank you all for listening. Today has been the present context of the space exploration here at IQT. Please check out the rest of our podcasts as they come out in order. This is a 3-part series. I'm your host, Vishal Sandesara. We'll catch you next time.